Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. My name's Dr. Gavan M Cooke, not Professor. I'm from the Northwest, Blackpool, not Manchester, and I'm a biologist, not a physicist. So if you left this evening saying, well, he's a poor man's Brian Cox, I would understand, because we can't all live up to his great name. But nevertheless, hopefully this evening you'll learn something about cephalopods, and also a little bit about what they do, their physiology, their behaviour, but also, hopefully, as interesting, where they came from. And despite recent public attention, they didn't come from outer space. They are from this planet, very much so, and they have a long history in their geological record and the fossil record. So I'm going to go through about where they evolved, where they came from, their evolutionary history, a little bit about their physiology and their behaviour, but also, as importantly, which species you find in the UK, what they do, what you can do as divers to help them, and also a little bit about citizen science and already the fantastic observations that you guys have provided with us and the recent discoveries that you guys have provided for us as well. So hopefully you'll learn something and enjoy it also as well. There won't be an exam at the end, fortunately. Okay, so cephalopods, what are they? Well, cephalopod is a term, means head foot essentially. It's a Greek word. Does anybody here say cephalopod? Okay, you guys can leave right now if that's okay. Joking aside, it's actually a Greek word, so my understanding is, and my feeling is that if it's a Greek word, you should say it like the Greeks say it, and they say cephalopod. However, it really doesn't matter. What matters is that you know what they are, where they came from, and a little bit more about them. And the sort of hierarchical ranking of cephalopods is equivalent to mammals. So that gives you an idea of the breadth of diversity that we're talking about. So a cephalopod, from a hierarchical point of view, is equivalent to a mammal. Okay? And in biology and zoology generally, we use this nature of classifying things. Linnaeus did this originally. So kingdom you're familiar with, we are animals, so the animal kingdom. And you move down until species. So cephalopods are in the animal kingdom, they're mollusks, as I'm sure you're familiar with, that's the phyla. And the class Cephalopoda, which is, like I say, equivalent to mammals, to give you some sort of basis for understanding. And I'm sure you're very familiar with Sepia officinalis. And you can look at this levelling a little bit like you might look at the planet, for example. So this might be planet Earth, this might be a continent, this might be a country, might be a town, a street, and then a house. So it gives you an idea of how we classify organisms and where cephalopods fit into this classification. And they're a very, very large class. There's a huge number of species, very, very diverse, and as I say, they've been around for a very, very long time, and they're still very, very abundant. So as mollusks, you will probably realise that they're actually much more closely related to snails and slugs than they are vertebrates, and especially the higher vertebrates, despite sharing many complexities and very derived, important, interesting behaviours that they share with vertebrates as well. But they are very much related to the slugs and snails, etc. So they are from a very different evolutionary pathway. They've been studied by humans, if you like. I don't think Aristotle would have called himself a scientist. A natural philosopher maybe, but they've been studied by others for at least 2,500 years, a little bit longer. So they're very much a part of our culture as humans. We're very aware of them, even if it's in a passive sense. They're everywhere you look around, particularly in iconography. As an extant group, and extant just means the opposite of extinct, so the cephalopods that remain today, they're very, very diverse, as I'm sure you're aware. You have the common European cuttlefish, which I'm sure you're familiar with. You have giant octopuses over there, the GPO. You have giant squids. We even have giant cuttlefish, but they're not actually that giant compared to the other cephalopods. We have very weird and wonderful things like the vampire squid and also the Dumbo octopus as well. We have cephalopods that use bioluminescence, like the bobtail squid from Hawaii in the far left corner, and also far right view. And also the firefly squid, which again uses symbiotic bacteria to glow, to make a light system in the very deep, dark water. So we go from the massive, really like the giant squid, which is, has the largest eye in the animal kingdom, right down to the ram's horn squid, which is only a few millimetres across, very, very small. So hopefully you get the idea that they're incredibly diverse, and of course not forgetting the nautilus, which is very much an outgroup. It's a very ancient, distantly related cephalopod to everything else. So these guys really are quite distantly related from everything else you see here. And if you look at them, you can quite easily see that they look more primitive, their behaviours are much more simple. They can't camouflage or change colours, just like the other cephalopods can. And in fact, we generally separate nautiluses from the coleoid cephalopods, as we call them, when we're talking about them, because they are so rudimentary and so different from regular cephalopods, if you like. And as I say, in culture, cephalopods are very well known. For example, the Kraken myth has been repeated throughout history. I think the word kraken comes from Scandinavian countries. However, most indigenous cultures in the last 1,000 years or so have some sorts of myth relating to a giant cephalopod of some kind. Normally it's a squid, but often confused with a giant octopus, but the kraken myth is alive and well. In ancient Grecian artwork and Roman artwork, you'll often see octopuses decorated on vases and so on, so we've been aware of them for quite a long time. More recently, if you're into steampunk and know what that is, a sort of a archetypal animal for that sort of genre of culture. People are getting a lot of tattoos of octopuses these days. And Kraken rum, has anyone tried Kraken rum here?
Oh, yeah.
Really nice, isn't it? It's very sweet and it can get a bit sickly after a while, but it is really, really good. And even more modern, if you like, we're starting to try and adapt cephalopod camouflaging abilities in a military sense and trying to use it in less fun ways than you might do. So the military are taking on these ideas that cephalopods and their abilities and what they can do. So in our culture for a long time, we've been aware of cephalopods, even if it's in a passive sense. So next, I'm just going to go through where they came from, really, to give you some idea of how old they are and how they relate to mammals, etc. The cephalopods originally evolved from their last common ancestor around 565 million years ago, so a really long time ago, 500 million years, which is way, way down here on this nice little pretty geological scale. And to give you some sort of comparison, mammals evolved around here somewhere. So they've been around for a lot longer than we as mammals have, never mind us as primates or as a Homo sapiens species. So they are very, very ancient, very rich lineage, been around for a long time, originated around the time of sort of what's called the Cambrian explosion, perhaps, where lots of animals evolved all at the same time. But cephalopods survived all the various extinctions that they've gone through. And one way that scientists or zoologists in particular like to look at the relationships between animals, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is the idea of using a tree to understand their relationships. So this is a tree of the cephalopod tree of life, if you like. At the bottom here you have the last common ancestor around 560 million years ago, all the way up to today's extant cephalopods, the ones that are still around and not extinct. So things like cuttlefish, ram's horn I mentioned, squid, vampire squid, octopuses, stuff that you're familiar with, stuff that has survived and remained around today. And as you can see from this, the Nautilus has actually evolved a long, long time ago and have survived very various and considerable mass extinctions along the way as well. So when you talk about Nautilus as being very old, you can see relative to where the coleoid cephalopods evolved, you can see just how ancient they are and just how much of an outgroup they are and just how different they are compared to the other cephalopods. As I say, cephalopods have survived some pretty mean times. During the late Permian, there was a massive extinction event where 99% of all the animals on the planet died in pretty short timescales. And this is known as the Permian mass extinction. It resulted because of a huge eruption, a volcano or volcanic explosions the size of India, roughly, completely covered the planet in soot, and a lot of things died out. Like I say, 99% of all animals were probably lost at that point. But nevertheless, ammonites, who I'm sure you're familiar with, which are fossils, or you'll be familiar with them as fossils, actually survived this event and went on to continue. Sometimes you'll see fossils of Orthoceras, and I'll show you a picture of those shortly. Unfortunately, they didn't make it through the PT extinction event, but as you can see, some of these more interesting and charismatic fossils have done, including the original coleoid cephalopod or cephalopod. But as you can see, there was another major extinction, and you'll be very familiar with this one. Can anyone guess what else died at this point? Yeah, exactly, the dinosaurs. Everyone's familiar with the KT extinction event where a big asteroid smashed into the planet, and everyone knows that it killed the dinosaurs off, but it also killed a lot of other things off as well. And ammonites are actually really cool little animals. We know quite a lot about them from their fossil record, and bits about their behaviour, and they are actually really interesting cephalopods, but sadly they didn't make it through this massive extinction event. However, the ones that we're familiar with today did, fortunately. So sometimes species win, sometimes they lose, depending on the nature of the catastrophe surrounding them. So these are fossil ammonites. These are from my own collection. These are actually collected in and around Dorset. If you ever go to the Jurassic Coast, you'll find lots of these, and also lots of these as well. These are known as belemnites, and they're very, very common. You can't walk for tripping over them, actually. And these are actually cephalopods as well, and of course, ammonites are as well. You can see from the evolutionary lineage that actually belemnites evolved relatively late and didn't actually have that long a time scale, whereas the belemnites evolved way down in the past and actually survived for quite a long time before going extinct. And as you can see, my collection of fossils is expanding rapidly, and I'm sure I annoyed my wife when I emptied eBay of all these weird plates that you get from Morocco in particular. And these often contain little ammonites, which you won't be able to see in there, but this slab of marble that came from somewhere, which is very expensive to post them in, you have no idea. This is an Orthoceras, so it's a long tubular cephalopod. And as you can see from the diagram, they didn't actually do very well. You often see these, you might have seen these before, these are Orthoceras, so these are a cephalopod as well. And as I say, you can often find these plates and other antiquity stuff on eBay, and these are actually, again, Orthoceras, and occasionally you'll find ammonites in them as well. So actually, without realizing it, you may have these in your home. If you go to shopping centres, especially very posh ones, they actually use this sort of stuff for flooring. So you can walk around the posh shopping centres on your hands and knees looking at the fossils, only to be quickly removed by security. But nevertheless, it can be a fun afternoon if you're not diving, I guess. So there's another weird group of extinct ammonite species, and these are known as heteromorphs. And now these really, really are odd. You've got really uncoiled spirals, which is very dissimilar to the more common completely spiraled ammonites. And in fact, Linnaeus, I think it was, certainly zoologists around the same time, actually hypothesized that these were the dying embers of a species. He thought, or they thought, that because they'd become uncoiled, they were actually rubbish now and they were about to die off as a species. But actually, we now know that these evolved long before the ammonites that we know them, and actually evolved into the coiled, hard-coiled ammonites as well. So unfortunately, sometimes we make mistakes, but as the fossil record has revealed, and as our geological dating has improved, we actually realised that it was the other way around. These guys evolved into the coiled ammonites. Now, I would never be forgiven if I spent my money on these fossils. For example, these can be very, very expensive, but they're very beautiful pieces of artwork, if you like. And these are sort of display specimens. Often, ammonites in particular will be pyritized, and you can actually have large deposits of gold within the ammonites themselves. I don't think you find these in the Jurassic Coast, but you never know. Certainly around the world, they're easy to find, or relatively easy to find. And you have belemnites that are made from opal and other nice gemstones and so on. So they can be really, really nice. But it's all well and good having these lovely fossils to look at and to waste all your money on, but what did they actually look like? And when I started looking at ammonites and belemnites as an undergrad, just sort of collecting them from Robin Hood's Bay in Yorkshire and various other places, I really wanted to know what they looked like. And as the years have gone by, we've actually discovered more and more about their lifestyles. But as interestingly, we now actually have a huge range of paleo artists. And these guys actually reconstruct what the animals look like based on our scientific knowledge. And some of the images are really fantastic. For example, we have a good idea that the ammonites were much more complex than the nautilus, despite looking very similar to them. We know they had tentacles, which had suckers on the end. And these suckers can be very, very complex. We actually, and this surprised me a lot, belemnites actually weren't hard at all, at least on the outside. Their tube was covered by soft parts, and they looked a lot more like squid, but with a hard internal shell. And you'll notice from this image here that actually the belemnite is inking as well, and we know that from the fossil record because sometimes, very rarely, properties like their insect are preserved. So this reconstruction is relatively accurate in the sense that they certainly had an external epidermis, soft tissue, and they were capable of inking as well. And then you have the Orthoceras, which I mentioned a few times, and these guys seem to have a very hard shell and no external soft parts. So these paleo artists are doing a really fantastic job of providing us with images that we can fill in the gaps for our imagination. And of course, they tried their hand at the heteromorphs as well. For example, there's these weird things, and they seem to have face plates for some reason. We don't understand why they had these face plates, but nevertheless they did. And using a little bit of imagination and good science, they've created these stunning pieces of work. And some artists have gone even further and created reconstructions of the possible environment. Now, if you're a real paleontology nerd like I can be, you'd actually know that this was before flowering plants. This is at least 400 million years old, this reconstruction, because there's no flowering plants on the land. These are all carboniferous like trees, lichens, and so on and so forth. And when you look below the water, you'll see a belemnite attacking very ancient fish-like thing. These are very ancient like fish. You'll have an ammonite attacking prey and so on. And it just gives you a really feel about what the animals were like and what they were doing all these hundreds of millions of years ago. And again, this is a really nice picture because it's fairly accurate in the sense that it is a really alien world to us. It's not the world that we recognize at all. There are no trees, for example, trees as we know them, because trees are actually flowering plants, and there weren't any flowering plants around these times. So it's a really alien world with alien animals, and these artists are able to give us an impression of that. And lastly, when it comes to sort of paleo art, so this wonderful timeline by this artist here, and it gives you a nice idea of the sort of timeline of cephalopods from the early sort of crawling snail-like things right through to the heteromorphs and the ammonites, and then you see the nautiluses arrive, you see the belemnites briefly appear, and lastly you end up with the cuttlefish, octopuses, vampire squid, and so on. So I really like these artistic impressions of these paleo images because it brings to life these rather dry, dusty shells and so on. So it can be quite interesting if you look for these on the internet. So it's fantastic that we have these hard parts that fossilize really well, but you're probably wondering, what about all the other animals, the octopuses and squids? Even the cuttlefish cuttlebone doesn't preserve that well. You know, if you'll see them on the beach, you'll see that many of them are fragmented, they're snapped in half, they're rotten, they're degrading in some way, so you're perhaps wondering how well they fossilize. And the fact is that they don't fossilize well at all, and it's extremely, extremely rare that you'll find a preserved specimen of a soft-bodied cephalopod. Now this example here I really wanted to buy, but it turned out to be $35,000, which is more of a museum piece than would fit in my living room. It's huge, it's a couple of meters long, it's a gigantic example of an early cuttlefish. This picture here is a bit more preserved, you can see the tentacles of the cuttlefish. Likewise, this octopus here, and you can even see the ink sac here. So this is where we get the evidence from that the earlier cephalopods were actually capable of inking, because sometimes, very rarely, the ink sac can be preserved, which is a miracle in some ways, but great for us. And then you have some ancient squids which actually had sharpened, not claws obviously, but sharpened protein or chitin, if you like, used for dismembering prey with. So it's thanks to these very rare fossils that actually we do know something a little about the early evolutionary history of the coleoid cephalopods, the ones that you're really familiar with. And can anyone hazard to guess what these fossils have in common?
Are they the same kind of stone?
Exactly, yeah. You might have noticed that they're roughly the same colour. And these are all limestone. There's a particular fossil bed in Germany, which is known as the Lagerschloss, because it means mother lode of brilliantly preserved fossils. And you actually find these only in this type of environment. And it's likely that this environment was a hypersaline environment, because hypersaline means that very little oxygenating bacteria can destroy the bodies and allows them to be preserved in a very specific way. And for a long time, Germany, or the fossil beds in Germany, were really world leading in their ability to produce these outstanding but supremely rare fossils. Now these days, China has caught up massively. They've discovered huge numbers of beds and are now producing these fantastic fossils at an amazing rate. But despite them being very, very unlikely to preserve, if you look long enough and you look hard enough, you will find evidence of the early evolution of these soft-bodied animals. So I've really hopefully given you an idea about where cephalopods came from, a little bit about their diversity, a tiny bit about what they're like as fossils and so on, and even a little bit about what they might have looked like and how they might have interacted with their environment. So now I'm going to move on to what we know about, or what cephalopods are around today. We know there's around 800 species, at least. When I first started looking at cephalopods, we thought there was around 700 species, so it gives you an idea that we're constantly finding new species. Now, the new species either come from the depths, where we find animals where we've never visited before, or using molecular techniques, we're actually splitting some species up. For example, Sepia feronis, many of you might have seen if you've dived in the Philippines or Thailand or even Australia. It's a very cosmopolitan species, but we now actually think it's 5 separate species rather than the one species. So molecular zoologists, if you like, are either lumpers or splitters. They either split things into millions of little species, or they group things together. And we seem to be splitting a number of living cuttlefish up. And we're also adding to the knowledge of what we have by exploring the deep oceans. They're only found in marine habitats. You don't find a single freshwater species at all. And they are extremely cosmopolitan in that they are found globally in both the poles and all other marine environments. Now, some people, including paleontologists, have said perhaps we're in the age of the cephalopods now. Perhaps cephalopods have never been more diverse and never been more abundant. And that's difficult to say because of the unlikeliness of the preservation or the fossilization of soft-bodied cephalopods. So we do get a skewed picture. We don't know really how many species of soft-bodied cephalopods there were in the past. It's very difficult to say. We only really see the hard ones, the ones that have got hard parts that fossilize really easily. So it's a bit difficult to say. One thing that does seem to be happening is that if there is a single positive to come from human-induced or anthropogenic climate change, is that we do actually seem to be encouraging cephalopods with how we're changing the global climate. We're also removing their predators in large degrees as well, and there is sufficient evidence to suggest that because of human activity, cephalopods numbers are actually on the rise in many, many species. I think there's at least 60 species where we've shown that they are greatly increasing in numbers, and this is probably linked to our influence on the planet. It's very easy to get very pessimistic about what we're doing with the planet, especially when it comes to the mass extinction that we are presently triggering. But if there's one glimmer of hope, really, it's that the planet has gone through at least 5 mass extinctions before. And during these extinctions, or after rather, life has exploded into new and wonderful animals and filled all the ecological niches that were now newly available. So even if we do our very damnedest, as long as we don't survive as well, I have great faith in life returning. And it's become a cliche, but life will find a way. You know, no matter what we do to the planet, short of exploding it, life will return in some ways. And interestingly, perhaps, some animals do benefit from our changes. And I think cephalopods could turn out to be one of those species. So looking a little bit at the relationships between the present cephalopods, this is just like the tree I showed you before, but flipped on its side for some reason. I didn't create it, so don't blame me. But it kind of gives you a sufficient idea of their relationships just from a wonky angle. As you can see, Nautiluses are the outgroup, if you like. They're very ancient, very simple compared to modern cephalopods. And intuitively, you'll see that things who look like they're related to each other are related to each other. So cuttlefish are very closely related to the bobtail fish. Now, many of you would have predicted that based on how they look, their morphology, their behaviours. They do look very similar, they live very similarly, and they are very closely related. Then you have the squids, which again are actually very, very diverse, much more diverse than many of the other remaining cephalopods, and they occupy a number of different classes of cephalopod. And then you have the octopods as well, which again are quite diverse compared to the cuttlefish. Now, there's 100 species of cuttlefish, but they're actually not that different from one another. They have very similar body patterns or body plans, if you like. Their behaviour is very similar. They reproduce identically. So actually, the cuttlefish are one of the least diverse, apart from pattern and colours, of the remaining cephalopods. But you do have some real weirdos as well. Have you guys heard of the vampire squid? Has anybody? Put your hand up, you guys. Okay, so about half of you. Now, fascinatingly, it's not a vampire at all. Neither is it a squid. So the name is completely rubbish. However, it is a fascinating animal. And we only recently discovered this through ROV work and deep water work. And it really is an oddball. And we know from molecular work that it is actually on its own lineage. It does its own thing from an evolutionary history and is really unrelated to everything else we know. And some evidence of that is that fact it's the only non-predatory cephalopod in the oceans as well. It uses this webbing to catch marine snow, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's all the rubbish that floats down, all the organic stuff floats down, and it catches it and eats it. So it's a detritivore, really. So it's the only non-predatory cephalopod that's called a vampire as well. So there's a little bit of confusion over there. And actually, interestingly, common names do change a lot, okay, over time. Don't expect this to remain being called vampire squid, because one of the issues with using common names is that people change them to suit what the animal actually is like. So it won't be too long, perhaps, before this vampire squid is called the rubbish-catching squid or something equally unimaginative. Looking at their internal anatomy a little bit, cephalopods, if you look at their internal anatomy, it kind of really betrays their simple ancestry. They're actually very, very simple and basic on the inside. You have very few organs. They're certainly nowhere near as complex as vertebrates are with respect to the nervous system, sorry, not the nervous system, but the endocrinology and other aspects which we are much more complicated with. If you weren't aware already, cephalopods have a beak, which again sounds really weird. You don't expect birds to have beaks, but nevertheless, all the remaining cephalopods do. And in fact, it's only the beak that we often find, and most, or at least a lot of squid species were only known by their beaks up until fairly recently. And we actually found them in the stomachs of whaling, for example, because whales are big squid eaters. So a lot of our taxonomy work, a lot of our understanding of squid diversification is based on beak shape alone up until more recently, where we've discovered more through underwater technology. As you'll be familiar with, they have an ink sac, they have gills, they have reproductive systems, but they are relatively simple. There's not a huge amount going on in there, certainly compared to vertebrates. And this isn't where their complexity lies. As you'll be aware, their complexity lies with their behaviour and their colour pattern ability, which is, luckily for us, quite interesting. They have a remarkable number of sense organs despite this simplicity internally. They have what's called a statocyst, and this gives them information about gravity and acceleration. So it's like their inner ear, if you like. We all have an inner ear, which gives us balance and tells us how far we're going and where, and at what speed. And if it doesn't work, it'll make you sick sometimes. Especially if you've been on a boat, you guys will know if you look down reading something, your inner ear will think you're doing one thing, but your vision will think you're doing another, and before long you gain a bit green. And cephalopods don't, but they have this thing. They also have a lateral line analog. Now, if you know anything about fish morphology, fish have a lateral line which runs down either side of their body, and this detects water movement or water vibration, and it's sort of a hearing organ. By detecting vibrations, they can sort of hear the environment around them. Interestingly, they can feel touch, or they have touch sensors, and they can almost certainly feel pain. Okay? We are very aware of this from a biological and physiological point of view. There's a huge number of studies suggesting that they can feel pain. These studies are based on behavioural observations of some people doing rather bad things to them. They also have free nerve endings, open nerve endings in their epidermis, in their skin. The only reason, so we have those as well, other mammals have those as well, which is something that tells us we're feeling pain. They also produce opiates in their brain, which mediates their behaviour if you do something painful to them. So if you give them opiates, they will stop feeling or stop reacting to painful things, very much like vertebrates would do. Interestingly, they have cannabinoid receptors as well. If you know anything about cannabinoids, you'll find that quite bizarre, but nevertheless, they certainly do. And there's all sorts of observational evidence suggests that they can suffer not only physically but psychologically as well. If you give a cephalopod a poor environment, they'll become psychologically stressed, and the evidence from this is quite clear. They will stereotype or negatively stereotype. So if you've ever seen a chimpanzee rocking in a zoo that's got terrible conditions, you know intuitively that it's suffering. But if you put a cephalopod in a similar impoverished environment where it needs an enriched environment, you'll find them pacing up and down the tank clearly in a distressed way. And as a result of this knowledge, we now protect these animals in the use in science in the EU and the UK. So if you want to do something that would cause some stress or pain in the UK, you have to apply for a very extensive license, and it's very difficult to do. And in fact, they're the only invertebrate to be protected in this way. All other vertebrates are, but now we have, since 2011, the first time an invertebrate has been protected. They're also protected in Australia, Scandinavian countries, and some other places as well. So we take very seriously this idea that they can feel pain, and they can suffer psychologically as well. It's something as scientists that we do take very, very seriously and have quite a very high degree of confidence in. Something else that's interesting about them is they have a great degree of chemoreceptors, so they can smell and taste chemicals. For example, an octopus will have 10,000 such receptors on each sucker, which is a huge number. You might be wondering, is that really a good thing? Would it be nice to taste with our fingertips? Sometimes it might be nice to taste cakes if you can just touch them. Other times you're touching things that you really don't want to be tasting as well. So it's a mixed blessing if you're humans. But nevertheless, octopuses use this technique to hunt with. They'll smother a reef, for example, and stick their tentacles in, and each one will be able to tell the main brain which bits of food and which aren't bits of food, and then bring it back to the mouth. And they can do this by taste. If you try to fumble around in something, and all you could do was touch, you wouldn't know if something was food or something less appealing, would you? But octopuses certainly can do that. They can reach in there and grab stuff as well. And interestingly, they have a high degree of decentralization. So octopus in particular don't actually have a central brain as such. Their brain is actually donut-shaped, and even weird, their stomach passes through it as well. So their morphology is very bizarre, certainly to us. And they also have a large number of clusters of ganglia in and around their body. So their arms are thought to operate at times more or less independently from their brain. So their arms have their own ideas what they want to do based on their chemoreception. And sometimes the brain will say, no, come back here, come back this way, please, please, please. And it's just so weird. Cephalopods are just weird generally. This is just one of the examples in the way that cephalopods are super weird. Interestingly, their vision is very, very decent. They have 360-degree vision, so they can see 360 degrees at all times. Yet most of them are colourblind. In fact, not all of them are colourblind. Nearly all of them are colourblind, rather. They can see UV and also polarizing light. Now, if you've ever had terrible visibility when you're diving, having polarizing light would save the day. You're able to see through the poor visibility, essentially. And we think that's what they use polarizing light, or the reception of polarizing light, for. We think it enables them to see in super turbid water. So maybe someone can invent something for you guys that mimics that in some ways and allows you to dive on really horrible viz days. And another interesting factor is if you look at the human eye compared to the octopus eye, you actually see the abilities rather similar, and they look fairly similar superficially. But human eyes have a huge blind spot, which our brain makes up for, but nevertheless we miss some information because of our blind spot here. Octopus eyes don't have this blind spot. Their eyes are better in that way. And this is quite simply because the human eye is the result of hundreds of million years of changes of evolution, from when it was a fish, to a reptile, to a proto-mammal, to a primate, and to us finally. Our eyes are the result of lots of movement around the head. And as a result, the wiring is absolutely awful. If you were to wire an eye, you would not do it like this at all. Whereas an octopus eye has stayed rather similar for rather a long time, and its ancestors had its eyes in the same place as well. So it hasn't had to move its eye around in its head, and because of natural selection, it's kept it where it is, and the wiring is actually really, really good. But unfortunately, our human eye wiring is terrible. It leads to all sorts of problems, not least this blind spot. So we often think of octopuses in particular having much better eyesight than we do, and it's arguable that that they do. So everyone's heard about octopus and cephalopod intelligence generally, and it's nice to know the reality of that. For example, Octopus vulgaris has around 500 million nerve cells, and this is sort of the number that a cat or a dog would have, yet they're actually much more cognitive, and much higher cognition than a cat or a dog. For example, they're very adept at learning, sensitization and habituation, simple avoidance stuff. They're also good at complex stuff, trial and error, which is more like associative learning, which a cat or dog can do, but not so well. They're also very good at spatial learning, so things like solving mazes. Again, a cat or a dog would never be able to do that. So they actually really outsmart many mammals. And there are also some relatively weak evidence, but evidence nevertheless that they're able to socially learn as well. So if one octopus is exploring something and learns how to access the food within this little object, it might take 5 to 10 minutes. Another octopus might watch it and then actually learn from the first octopus and avoid the mistakes the first octopus made. Now again, the evidence isn't super strong, and it has been thought that might not be the case, but nevertheless it is quite intriguing because it would be an extremely important step. We know quite clearly that cuttlefish, for example, have what we call episodic memories. Now, an episodic memory is the ability to see the past, if you like, and visualize the past, know where you are in the present, and use both sets of information to predict the future. And I don't mean predict the future like that stupid octopus, not the stupid octopus, the stupid aquarists, who were saying that the octopus could predict the World Cup scores in 2006, I think it was. What I mean is that they're able to base what they think will happen in the environment and act accordingly. And that is really rare in the animal kingdom. Not many animals can do that. Very, very few animals can do that, and it's really, really remarkable. And also that very complex and very clever, sophisticated, yet simple experiments have shown that cuttlefish, for example, have number sense. They have a form of ability to count things, which is remarkable. Really, only chimpanzees, as far as I know, are able to do this outside of the animal kingdom. There may be some evidence that some cetaceans can, or maybe some corvids, but it's extremely rare that you find an animal that can count, except for ourselves, of course. So there's a huge amount of evidence suggesting these guys are extremely clever, extremely clever. And you remember that these are actually invertebrates and more closely related to slugs and snails, and it really starts to make you wonder how on earth did this happen, and where on earth did it come from? And one of the manifestations of this remarkable intelligence is tool use. I'm sure you've all seen Blue Planet 2 when it came out last year or this year. And there's this remarkable scene where an octopus, in a very ad hoc, in a very spontaneous way, picked up these shells and hid from the shark that it previously tried to strangle as well. I mean, how cool is that? Never mind that it only just try and strangle a shark, which I wouldn't fancy doing, but it then hid behind some shells and avoided being eaten. And it's this idea that the animal can know what these are for, use them, and then discard them. And this differs quite differently from what you might call sort of opportunist refuge use. Now, if an animal ran behind a rock and avoided predation, that wouldn't take a lot of intelligence. This is something really different. Using an object temporarily to avoid predation and then to discard it shows real intelligence. And interestingly, this was not the first time we'd seen this in octopuses. In fact, this evidence of the coconut using veined octopus is actually really old. It's about 10 or 15 years old now. We've known for quite a while that octopuses could use tools. And this is tool use because it's picked up the coconuts at some point, worked out that they're useful not being eaten or rolling down hills, as this individual seems to do, but also carries around with them because it knows in the future they're going to be useful again. And it's this step, this quantum leap in intelligence, which really separates them from the things that we think are intelligent in the mammals, for example. They really are much smarter than many mammals, which we normally associate as being higher vertebrates. And we know well that animals sleep. You might be surprised to know that nearly all animals sleep in some way or some fashion. But the more intelligent animals seem to require sleep more. And this video is from Andy Jackson, who very generously shared lots of his videos with me, ones that weren't suitable for media broadcasting. And this particular clip is one of some cuttlefish for about 55 minutes. He diligently stays with them for 55 minutes. And we worked out, actually, that these guys are asleep for most of those 55 minutes. They're actually drifting in and out of consciousness. And we followed them around this cove, and we've made some maps, and this is just large kelp on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, and there's other bits of debris in the middle, and we followed them, like I say, for about 55 minutes, and we have a good understanding of what they're doing. And most of them are really dozy. For example, they've got their eyes closed, and you can see when a cuttlefish has got its eyes closed because it actually reflects the light. If a cuttlefish's eyes open, you wouldn't see this bright white. And you can also notice other things as well, like their bodies will tip from normally a 30-degree angle down to sort of negative 30-degree angle, and you can just sort of see them falling asleep like you would a child or a puppy. And they do other things as well, like some of them will twitch, and often many of us will twitch in our sleep. And there's one that I call twitchy, because it twitches more than the others. And you can just really get this impression that they're sleeping. And this is actually not new in some ways. We've known in a laboratory setting that they do sleep, that they have REM sleep as well. And it's possible that they're actually dreaming as well, which is quite remarkable. And in this clip, there's a really lovely bit which I'd like to show you of a cuttlefish waking up. And it just really, for me, gives you an idea of what, how awake these, or how sentient these guys are. So this individual here is really dozy. You know, its mantle fin slows to a stop sometimes. You can see it's just hovering there. It's not bothered by the cameraman at all. And we know, again, from laboratory experiments that actually these guys will change colour when they wake up or fall asleep. So this guy, you know, you can see he's getting closer and closer and closer, and in a minute he'll be disturbed by something, and he just wakes up. And do you see that? You see that moment when 1 minute it's unconscious, and the next minute it's conscious. And that's what's really different about this. That's how we think that they have this sentience, this awareness. They are conscious of the world around them. And I'll show you that again, because it is a really lovely moment. And it just perks up, suddenly awake, whereas before it wasn't. And it's just, for me, a really lovely example of how these guys are much more like us as sentient beings than we have realized, perhaps. So, after looking at their sensory abilities, I'm going to talk a little bit about their patterns, signals, and color changes, because they're intricately linked, okay? And I'll show you why they're linked in a minute or so. But obviously they're very well known for their pattern changes. Again, this is from Blue Planet 2. Again, you'll be familiar with this. This is a Sepia latimanus, I think, and it's attacking a crab, essentially. And it's using this pattern in some way to aid its ability to get the crab. Now, we used to think, or perhaps it could still be the case, is that they're actually hypnotising the crab. Although my understanding is that the evidence is actually relatively weak for that. The crab eyes don't work in such a way whereas this would actually hypnotise them. And a friend of mine suggested that, Krakens suggested that something more intriguing actually. Now, if you're a crab, you're watching this and you see the cuttlefish, you focus on these lines and you say, I can see that speed, I can see what's coming, I can judge the speed of these lines coming at me, I can do that much. But what happens is that the feeding tentacles actually move at a different rate, a faster rate. So whilst the crab is focused on dealing with something coming at a set speed, the arms come out at a separate speed and completely fool it. So this might not be hypnotising as such, but it's certainly fooling the crab into being eaten essentially. And this is unbelievable pattern changes. You know, when I first saw this, it looks like CGI. It doesn't look real compared to all the animals that we're all normally familiar with. And again, these are not the first bits of footage. This was taken by Roger Hanlon, and this is one of the first things I ever saw, which really blew my mind. Unfortunately, it's a GIF, so it'll keep repeating. But if you start from here, you can hardly see it, and then suddenly it appears from nowhere. And this individual actually is using more than just colour changes. He's actually using what we call papillation. So his skin is becoming bumpy, and he's mimicking the seaweed, not just by the colour and the bumpiness of the skin, but also by the swaying of the seaweed as well. And it's a remarkable suite of abilities which allow this, unbelievable camouflage. You would not see that unless the camera had gone into it. And my understanding is that it was somewhat on accident. He discovered the octopus at the last moment and moved closer and closer and disturbed it. So it is incredible what these guys can do. But it's not just the octopuses or the cuttlefish. Squid are remarkable at this as well, and they use this in communication quite often to the opposite sex, the females. They'll talk to one another in a fashion using these remarkable abilities to pattern change. So it's not just the octopuses or the cuttlefish. Bobtail squid can also do it, and of course, as you see here, squid. You're probably wondering how they do it. And it's actually relatively simple. Simple as a concept and an idea, but actually very hard in practice. Each bit of skin has a pigment, and they're different coloured pigments, and this is from an octopus's skin. And each pigment is a different colour, or the primary colours that they actually use. And they change colour by having a ring or a circle of muscle around each pigment. And when the pigment wants to get larger and change colour, the muscles expand and make the pigment larger. And when it wants to change back to a different colour, the ring of muscles contracts and goes really, really small. And it's this muscle control which allows them to, instantaneously change colour and become masters of camouflage, as they're well known. Now, so far, so simple, really. It's a very simple idea when you think about it. It's just muscles contracting and expanding. But when you think about how many of these pigments and how many of these muscles the animal must have, it sort of blows your mind a little bit, because you have to have complete control over every single one of these, over their entire body, to make the patterns that they do at will when they want to, in an instantaneous fashion. And it's a remarkable set of neurology and complexity in the neural system which allows them to do this. They are unparalleled in their ability to do this. They really are really, really remarkable. I sort of have this pet idea, and I don't know if anyone's ever thought of this before, probably, because everyone's thought of everything already, more or less. But nevertheless, it's an idea I quite like. Humans, for example, we think are super intelligent because we're actually ridiculously social. And being social requires a high degree of cognition. It's very difficult to maintain relationships in the way that we do. We need big brains to do it. And that's where we think our big brains evolved from, is this need or desire or benefit from being social. So things like technology, music, art, are all really byproduct. Language as well, it's just a byproduct of being good at being social. Natural selection may not have selected for language, it may not have selected for art and music, at least after the fact. So we're possibly very intelligent because we're social. But cephalopods are rarely social. They're very, very, very insular. Octopuses are never social unless they're forced to be, or there is some new evidence suggesting that they might cohabit small areas. I have some evidence that cuttlefish may be more social, and there's one paper on it already so far. But generally speaking, they are very antisocial compared to primates, for example. So you could hypothesize that although evolution provided these byproducts in humans because of sociality, actually when it comes to cephalopods, their sentience, their abilities, their tool use, etc., was a byproduct of their ability to change colour. They already had this neural complexity allowing them to change colour rapidly because of all these muscles they have to control. So all these other aspects which we marvel at are actually secondary and actually byproducts of this clever skin, if you like. And that's an idea that's really attractive, to me at least, but very difficult to prove. So what are these colour patterns for? As you're aware, as divers, you often suddenly find yourself on top of a cuttlefish because it's very well hidden. They don't just use them for hiding, they also use them for predation, and they're often ambush predators, jumping on things which haven't been seen, and they also use them in communication, as I say. And when in communication, there's lots of different ways that cuttlefish, for example, might use their ability to communicate. Interestingly, they don't use chemical communication like many animals do. Without knowing it, you'll be very aware of someone's urine. I know you don't realize it consciously, but subconsciously you'll pick up pheromones of all sorts of things from people's urine. And many, many animals use byproducts or waste products as a mean for communication. You'll see dogs urinating all over the place, and that's not because they have weak bladders, well, not least when they're adults. That's to send messages to other dogs, essentially. But weirdly, cephalopods don't seem to do this at all. There's very little evidence, or no evidence suggesting that they have any sort of olfactory or chemical communication, nor do they make any sounds that are used in communication either. So they rely solely on this visual communication aspect. And they do this in a number of ways. For example, as I mentioned about the octopus, they use this papillation of the skin. It becomes bumpy and raised, and this helps them look like their natural background. Their posture can help. For example, they might sort of have this weird posture that looks a little bit like seaweed, and again to help them remain camouflaged perhaps. But they can also use their posture to communicate. Now, if you've ever seen a cuttlefish doing this, if you have, can you put your hand up? Okay, that's actually telling you to go away. It means it's not happy. So if you see that, you might want to just move away a little bit. That's the first warning sign that a cuttlefish doesn't really want you that close. They also use their pattern and also their muscles. For example, when they sway like seaweed, that's them moving in time with the seaweed to, again, to hide perhaps. And originally, some scientists suggested that they noted there was 34, at least, different 34 pattern or parts to the patterning of a cuttlefish, for example. And it was hypothesized that this was actually their alphabet, if you like. But it turns out they don't really have an alphabet. There's no syntax, there's no sentence construction, there's no grammar in what they do. It's much more rudimentary than that. But nevertheless, you have at least 34 different ways of communicating differently using their body patterns and so on. Okay, so communication can be used to frighten predators. Many of the cephalopods will get really large when you go near them. That's because they're trying to look bigger than they do. And if you've ever been in an unfortunate situation where there's lots of angry men in the pub and they're pushing each other and swearing at each other, you'll see that they stick their chests out and try to look as big as possible. And all animals do this. They all try and bluff their opponent to start with by making them seem bigger. When men or even women are shouting at each other, their voice deepens a little bit, again to sound big and impressive and scary. Because it can work quite often. Animals generally don't like to fight. It's very risky and it can include damage and injury which you might not recover from. So quite often, bluffing your way through a fight is the most effective way, and cephalopods certainly do this by making themselves larger. Communication can be used to probably not hypnotize prey, but certainly distract prey long enough. And it can also be used to signal which sex they are as well. Because they look very, very similar, because there's very little dimorphism between the sexes, they actually tell each other which sex they are based on the colours they're emitting at a particular time. It can also be used to pretend to be another sex as well. Now, if you're a little male and you don't want to be beaten up by the big male, you might actually pretend to be a female for a little while. And these guys are very adept at doing that. You probably saw that on Blue Planet 2 as well. And there's some fantastic footage of the little guys pretending to be females and then sneakily copulating with females. But fantastically, some of them actually pretend to be male and female at the same time, just to confuse each other in a very weird way, and I'll show you some evidence of that. Again, this is just the footage from Blue Planet of the cuttlefish possibly using its patterning to distract a crab at least. And that's certainly a very remarkable use of this ability. But looking closer to home, you'll recognize these guys. This is sepia officinalis. Very large males. You would have seen these in April or May when they return from their wintering grounds. They're really big males. This is some wonderful footage, or still of the footage. And you see this male's actually lost a tentacle, an arm as well, because he's been fighting a lot. Now these guys are talking to each other without using words. This guy is saying, I'm bigger than you, and he's flaring himself out. He's using the zebra patterning to again show that he's a male and he's trying to be as big and bold as possible. When animals are really conspicuous, they're taking a risk. They could be eaten quicker by being conspicuous. So by being the most conspicuous, they're saying I can handle any predation. Despite being conspicuous, I'm still the best at mating or whatever. Whereas this guy is a little less conspicuous. He's a little drabber. You see, he's not quite as intensely zebra patterned as this guy, because he knows he's going to lose, really. Now, he's mate guarding the female, and he's sort of worried. He thinks he's going to lose his female, and eventually he does, because this guy is just bigger. But they also use their faces as well. You can see this guy's got a dark face. He's got very bright, conspicuous eyes. Where, again, this guy looks a bit drabber. He's not quite as confident as this guy. And ultimately, without even fighting so much, this guy will take the female, all based on their ability to communicate with one another. Okay? And this is a very common theme in the animal kingdom. This use of conspicuous signals is everywhere in the animal kingdom. But the way cuttlefish do it is unique in that they can change rapidly and deceive one another as well. Now, this was the original scientific research that first looked at what we call tactical deception. Okay? And some people think that for chimpanzees to tactically deceive other chimpanzees proves that they have a theory of mind. Now, a theory of mind is a very important step. It means that you are completely sentient and self-aware. Now, this is a clear example of tactical deception, at least according to the authors, and I would tend to agree. Here you have a male. Now, this male is signaling to this female that it's male and ready to reproduce. But this side of his body is actually signaling to another male, saying, leave me alone, I'm an unreceptive female. So he's splitting his body signal in half. He's saying, yes, mate, no, go away. And it's really, really clever if you think about it. The ability to know what's going on in the environment, the ability to change in respect to what the situation is at any given moment, because he's not permanently patterned like this. He doesn't just wait forever, hoping that there's a male on this side and a female on this side. He'd wait forever. He actively chooses which side to look like a male and female. Sometimes he'll look just like a male, sometimes he'll look just like a female. So this ability to tactically deceive other animals really gives you this idea that they're really aware of what's going on. They're really conscious to the life of the universe and everything. And thanks to you guys and people like you, we found some really remarkable footage. Again, this is from Andy, but the stuff that you provided before has revealed as interesting things. Now, we're not sure what's going on here. It's only one sample. And part of this talk is to try and get you to give us more samples, because we can't really say much about one individual doing one thing once. We need lots of them, because scientists are very skeptical, if you weren't already aware. And they love to say, no, it can't be true. So we need more evidence, really. And what you see in this one is, again, possibly tactical deception. You've got a male here, and this is sexually diagnostic of being male. That means it's very clearly the male. The white iridophores here that glow very clearly means he's male. And you can see there, they actually hides them. And there's other males in the background here, and this is a female. So he's hidden half of his arms, which look like male half, but left this half dangling out, which the female can see. Now, we can't say at the moment if this is another form of tactical deception, because we just have one record of it. So again, part of this talk that I'm doing and talking to other groups like yours is to try and get you to give us more information, because it's so difficult to find. It's possibly worth showing that again, if you didn't see it already. Sorry, excuse me. Despite being fairly clear, it's very difficult to get this sort of stuff published. You can't really publish a single occurrence of something. You need lots more evidence. So again, I'm really appealing to you guys as a group to share stuff with us. It doesn't matter how poor quality it is or how poor quality you think it is. You never know what you've seen until we actually have a good look at it. And behaviours like this could lead to something really exciting. This would be very, very novel if we were able to show that this was a new form of tactical deception. So that sort of leads on to reproduction, because we're talking about mating. As you'll be aware, you've probably seen them, you voyeurs, watching cuttlefish mate face to face. They do this for a few minutes, depending on the size of the male. Squid tend to do it in a perpendicular fashion, so they sort of come at the female like this. Whereas octopuses are really weird, as always. Some of them actually detach their arms, which is actually a penis arm, and then give it to the female and run away, or siphon away, or whatever they do. And they do this because some females are cannibalistic. Now, if I was with my cannibalistic wife, I might do what an octopus does. But nevertheless, I don't have to, thankfully. But it just shows you how weird and wonderful cephalopods can be. You'll certainly have seen squid laying eggs, or not necessarily seen them laying eggs, but having seen the eggs being laid. And these are the long white things. Many species might lay eggs at the same time. Oh, this looks tropical because of this bush here. But it's not an uncommon scene in the UK. You rarely see squid. I mean, you guys can tell me, how often do you see squid in the wild? Very rare. Yeah, night dives mostly. Yeah, you don't often see them. And in fact, CFAS, who are the fisheries organisation for the UK government, are desperate to find out more information about squid laying eggs. They are very heavily fished in the North Sea, for example, and in other areas, the Irish Sea and the Southwest. And we don't know really much about their reproductive biology, so we don't know if we're overfishing them. So CFAS have been super excited by the group that I'm running and observations that you guys are providing. Whenever someone posts a picture of an egg, I always tag Vlad, who's a colleague, and he always gets really excited because he rarely sees these pictures. So your stuff is really, really important, and I'll talk more about that shortly. This will be very familiar to you, cuttlefish laying eggs. I'm sure you've actually seen this happen on structures like this, whether artificial or natural, and you'll be familiar with these sea grapes, as they're called. They just look like grapes. They wash up from time to time, and you'll be familiar with this concept. Now, I want to talk to you very briefly about some of the issues with the cuttlefish numbers in the southwest. I've already spoken to a number of you independently and also other groups, and you're aware that possibly the number of cuttlefish in Babacoon, for example, aren't what they used to be. And it's possible that this is because of local fishermen. And the fishermen are catching the adults in lobster pots or similar, and it's a very good source. There was an article in The Guardian a few years ago saying there was a black gold rush because cuttlefish are worth a lot in the Mediterranean countries, and they sell very, very well, and they are being exploited by our local fishermen, which is fair enough. You know, they're there to make a living and so on and so forth. But the real problem comes with not taking the adults, because they bred, you know, they can be eaten, they've laid their eggs, they've given to the next generation. It's the fact that the eggs are tied to the lobster pots as well, and the lobster pots are coming up, and the fishermen are siphoning or hosing the eggs off them, and they're losing the eggs to the environment then, and the eggs won't hatch, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of work going in at the moment with people trying to put artificial egg-laying sites, and we have a good idea of what egg-laying sites females prefer. So maybe it's something you've encountered before, maybe it's something you're aware of as a local issue down in the southwest. But unfortunately, there are no fisheries quotas for cuttlefish. There's nothing to stop humans completely fishing them completely out of existence, if you like, at the moment. There will be some, there's a work with Brighton University who are looking at the impact of fishing on cuttlefish, and hopefully it can lead to some sensible quotas. We're not talking about stopping it entirely, but they do need to have some sensible quotas put in place at the moment, because we don't know what's happening. Now, interestingly, Sepia officinalis isn't endangered in the slightest. Okay, it's a very cosmopolitan species. It's very, very successful. It's extremely unlikely that it ever be fished to extinction. But what is possible is that locally it'll become far less abundant in the places that you guys dive. And it may be the case that you guys are seeing it far less. Some of your experienced divers may have anecdotal evidence that suggests that their numbers are decreasing in certain specific areas. But it's something we need to look into, I believe. So when they hatch, cuttlefish actually produce little miniature versions that are ready to go straight away. They look just like the adult form, but very, very tiny. And they immediately go after shrimp, mysids in particular, maybe gammarus and other grass shrimp, for example. And they are just miniature adults ready to go. And they're very easy to keep in a captive setting as a result. All you need to do is give them some grass shrimp or mysids, and they'll be absolutely fine. And this is one of the reasons that they're actually very important to aquaculture. And I've got a colleague, Dr. Antonio Sykes, who's becoming an expert at feeding them in captivity, because they are very popular in the Mediterranean countries. He's based in Faro. And it's important that we provide a sustainable source of protein, given that we are generally overfishing stuff. So they are becoming very important in aquaculture. And aquaculture is basically fish farming on land, so to speak. However, things like Octopus vulgaris are quite different. They have a paralarval stage, and this larval stage isn't a miniature adult, and you can't feed it small adult food either. They're actually very specific on zooplankton. And if you're familiar with what zooplankton is, it's actually a collective name for a huge number of tiny little organisms, whether it be fish larvae or tiny invertebrates, zooe, like crab larvae, for example. And it seems that octopuses and many, many other cephalopod species actually feed on a very specific type of zooplankton, and we don't really know which ones they're eating. And there's a lot of work going into finding out which particular zooplankton they actually eat. And unfortunately, whenever you keep species like these, and many of the major aquariums, for example, will show off that their octopus has hatched eggs, but sadly they don't know what they eat, and they will nearly always starve to death. So it's really quite sad that we're breeding these things in captivity without any clue about what they eat. So cuttlefish are absolutely fine. They produce miniature adults which will go along and eat things very easily. They're very easy to keep. In fact, in the US, there's a huge number of pet cephalopod keepers. Now, we don't actually keep cephalopods as pets so much. One or two brave people do, because they are very demanding. If you've ever kept fish, these are much harder to keep than reef animals, for example, or even the hard corals. But it's impossible to breed many, many species in captivity, yet we are still trying to. And one of the sadder things about cuttlefish and cephalopods generally is that they live very short but very fast lives, and they go through what's known colloquially as a big bang reproduction. So they have a short life, put on weight really, really quickly. They synthesize protein remarkably well. In fact, that's one of the reasons why they're important in aquaculture, is because their efficiency at synthesizing edible protein into their own muscle tissues, which have like zero fat in them as well. So they're very, very healthy. But as a result of this, and perhaps other aspects, they seem to die very, very shortly. Now, the colder water species generally live for a little bit longer than the warmer water species. Excuse me, and get much larger as well. So you'll find in your waters or our waters, our cuttlefish can get quite large, and they're really big, aren't they? Whereas in the Mediterranean, a full breeding adult may be much smaller, maybe only a third of the size. And that's probably because temperature influences reproductive or reproductive maturity. So they're actually taking longer to mature in the colder water, having 2.5 years rather than 6 months to become sexually mature, eating more as a result because they're here for longer, and getting much, much bigger. So in the Mediterranean, if you ever dive, you'll never see a cuttlefish as you see it as big as in the UK waters. They just get much, much larger. And it's quite sad. If you've ever kept pet rodents before, you'll know that, in particular, rats, for example, only live a couple of years. You get quite attached to them because they've got distinct personalities. They're quite fun, and then very sadly, after a couple of years, they die, and you quite hard on you, especially your kids if you've got them as well. And it's the truth for cephalopods as well. I've kept thousands in the research aquarium that I worked in, and you'd have them in large stock tanks, and we're doing experiments with them. But every now and again, a runt would need saving, and you'd put the runt in a display tank, and you'd have it on show all the time, and you'd get used to it. It'd feed out of your hand and so on. And then very sadly, after a couple of years, they would die. So they have this trade-off between complexity and short lives, it seems, and it's something quite unusual in the animal kingdom. And when they are about to die, they go through this period of senescence where they just allow themselves to deteriorate. Now, you may have been familiar with the very rare sightings of giant squid in relatively shallow waters. Have you guys seen that before? Occasionally it makes the media. Once every 2 years perhaps, a giant squid will be in relatively shallow water where divers can actually swim with them and touch them and get really close to them. Now, no one's really sure why they do this, but I think it's fairly clear. If you look at this individual, it's allowed its body to deteriorate, it's got large chunks missing, it's almost certainly blind, at least in one eye, and it's probably going through this period of what's called senescence, where it's not really in control of itself anymore, it's just sort of floating around, waiting to be eaten, and haphazardly end up in the shallow waters, which is where we end up seeing them and get reported in the media. So this senescence stage is quite weird. Okay, look a little bit about their feeding. As I say, all are predators, bar the vampire squid, which eats marine snow, if you like. They have very fast metabolisms, exceptional growth rates, again, which is why they're useful in aquaculture and other farming aspects. They're very, very strong. They can handle prey much larger and much stronger than they do are. But sadly, they damage very easily, and they often do not heal from this damage. And they have to be very careful when they're picking their prey not to damage themselves. For example, often they'll come behind the crab to grab it to avoid the very large pincers at the front, whereas fish will attack them from the side to avoid their mouths. So they're quite strategic in how they may attack a particular bit of prey. They have very varied diets, fish, crustaceans, and even other cephalopods, although they are obligated in their early lives to only eat crustaceans because they get an essential amino acid from crustaceans where they can't get from anywhere else. Which is why if you feed a pet cephalopod, in particular cuttlefish, you should always give them crustaceans to start with and not dead fish. So this is a fairly nice example of a cuttlefish feeding. You can see it's using its tentacles to distract the crab perhaps, and it's using a similar display as you've seen on the Blue Planet to actually pounce on it and pick up the crab, and then it will use its beak to scrape a tiny hole in the carapace of the crab, well, inject a mild neurotoxin which will disable the crab, and then the cuttlefish can eat the crab at leisure without being worried about being pinched or damaged. Now, if you keep these guys, this is like putting a hand grenade up the backside of the crab, because it just means the crab explodes everywhere, and all you see in the aquarium is bits of crab lying around. And it's one of the reasons why they're so difficult to keep, is that they're so messy eaters. They make a huge amount of mess on dismembering these very large crabs that they like to eat. They're also very defensive as well. The defenses can include flight, as in running away from a situation, or dymatic behaviours, which is basically a word for trying to scare you away. If you've ever seen a cuttlefish doing those dark eyes, it means it's not happy, it feels threatened. If it ever has a flattened body, it's trying to make itself look bigger again. So again, it feels threatened. The red ring around the outside, again, means it's not happy. And all these things add up to what is an unhappy cuttlefish that wants you to go away, at least to move back a little bit. Also, whenever you see a ghosting octopus, that means it's frightened as well, it's not happy. So if an octopus does this in your presence, it means you just need to move back a little bit because it's particularly stressed at that moment. And these things can really help you enjoy the animals without them damaging themselves. As I say, when they flee, they kind of jet erratically, and if they hit a rock with barnacles on, for example, they'll shred their skin and they won't heal from it, and they could die or be more easily predated. So they have this repertoire of behaviours which allows them to remain alive despite being very soft-bodied and very easily eaten. They also ink, as you're well aware, and I'll show you some really nice footage shortly of a bobtail squid inking what we call pseudomorphs, in that they puff out little bits of blobs of ink which are supposed to distract an enemy or a predator by looking roughly like the same shape as the bobtail squid itself. So finally, we're going to talk to you about the cephalopods that you're likely to see in the waters. You already know them, of course, but there might be one or two surprises as well. So we'll start with Sepia officinalis, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. But as I say, it's extremely cosmopolitan. You'll have seen it in your favourite dive sites around the UK, but it is very, very widespread, extremely widespread. So even if there are troubles in the southwest with respect to fisheries, nevertheless the species is very, very abundant, and it's unlikely we can do too much long-term damage to it as a whole. They do fluctuate naturally in their populations, depending on the environment, because they are exothermic. They get their energy from the outside rather than the inside. So if you have very warm summers, sometimes you may get more. Very cold winters, you may get less. It's a very complex situation. And again, you'll be very, very familiar with what Sepia officinalis look like, the common European cuttlefish, which are at least, well, can get to up to 500 millimeters long, which apparently is about 20 inches. But you may be more interested to know that we actually have two more species in our waters. And these are Sepia elegans, which is the elegant cuttlefish, and also Sepia, it's too hard to pronounce for me, which is known as the pink cuttlefish. Now these guys are much smaller than Sepia officinalis, and you won't have seen them ever when you dive. And that is because they actually spend all their lives in the much deeper waters, 100 meters plus. Okay, but what you will see is their cuttlebones. They wash up at just the same frequency as Sepia officinalis. So if you're a cuttlebone collector or you see them on the beach, don't just assume it's a common European cuttlefish. It could quite easily be one of these two species as well, especially the smaller ones. They're quite possibly Sepia elegans. Now the pink cuttlefish, actually their cuttlebones are pink when they're very fresh. They can really clearly pink. And very rarely they'll wash up on the beach pink as well. But they do lose that colour quite quickly. But they are much smaller than the real big cuttlebones from Sepia officinalis. Also, they have these rostrums or spikes on the end, which again can be diagnostic. And there are a number of good websites which will show you where your cuttlebone came from. So if you do see these, be aware that we actually have 3 species in our waters, not just the one, although you won't see many of the others alive. And to be honest, whenever you see a picture of an animal like this, which is clearly dead and been put in formaldehyde, you know that we know nothing about its behaviour, because if we did, we'd have a nice photograph. And the fact is, these only ever get brought up by trawls, and that's all we know about them. I'd love to stick some long-term photography footage, time-lapse camera, 200 meters down, and just find out what's going on down there. But at the moment, it's prohibitively expensive. And you can see all we know now is what we know when they're dead. So moving on to the octopus, many of you will have seen Elodine sahosa, the curled octopus. These are incredibly common in and around the UK, all the way up to that place there, Iceland, was very, very far away. But they're also in the Mediterranean as well. They're, again, very, very cosmopolitan. And you'll be very familiar with them. I'm sure the pictures like these aren't unusual to you guys. This is a fairly relaxed one. He's doing his normal behaviour. He's in sort of a cat-like posture, if you like. He's fairly relaxed. This guy here has eaten something. He's spread his web around the food. He's got the food near its beak. So if you see an octopus with its webbing out like this, and it's got a fairly inconspicuous colour, it's probably got some food. It's probably quite easy to tell. But what we are finding, and this was a real surprise to me and been one of the great delights of this project, is that we're actually seeing loads of information about them in rock pools. And not just in rock pools, but also in sandy habitats where we didn't realise they were living. They actually bury themselves in the sand sometimes when the tide goes out, which nobody had any idea that they do. Now, we know some octopus species do this around the world, but we've never known this until guys like you have given us photographs of them actually burying into the sand. So the stuff that you're providing is incredibly important. I really can't overstate how valuable your posts are, because we are learning so much about these animals. And I'll show you exactly, well not exactly, but some examples of what we're learning shortly. Octopus vulgaris, Lisa mentioned at the beginning of the talk, was extinct in our waters until past 1960s, when it thought a real cold snap put this animal off. This information comes from ICES, which is a very reputable fisheries organisation, but it's relatively outdated. We really don't see them like this in the northern parts of England, even in the southern parts, until recently. Again, the footage that Lisa provided with me was really cool. You know, it's a really spectacular large octopus, and Octopus vulgaris are much more interesting, if you like, than the curled octopus. They're much more dynamic, they're much more intelligent probably, they're much more interesting to watch, and they do things. So it's a real joy to have them back in our waters. It will really make your lives much more interesting seeing them, presumably on their return back to our waters. Now, we can't know if they're returning to our waters permanently or temporarily unless you guys keep sharing the information that you're doing. So again, really valuable what you're doing. And by cataloguing these sightings, we're able to show that they are back on the rise north, if you like. Now, we need more observations to say anything like that, but you know, thanks to you guys who are able to make a start. And this is photographed by Andy Shinton. Again, this is probably the same one that you guys filmed as well. And you'll notice they're very different. They've got really thick, stocky arms. Now, diagnostically, people talk about their suckers, but to be honest, I don't expect you guys to go around lifting octopus arms up and saying, yep, 2 suckers there. I think you're more likely to see these big, thick, strong arms, and also the colour patterns can be quite different. So they are definitely, obviously different from the curled octopus. And if you guys see them, please let us know. It'd be wonderful to find out more about their potential return to the UK. The squids, to be honest, I don't know very much about at all. I had to look at Wikipedia for some of this, and I could say that. But the fact is, we actually have 13 species of fish, squid, which I had no idea about. I knew there were 2 species of loligo vulgaris, for example, and the species you see are probably loligo vulgaris. But we have 13, but most of them are in deeper waters or migrate in and around the UK, so they don't even come up in trawls that often. And as I say, most are out to sea. However, you guys do find eggs, and as I said before, simple photographs of eggs are actually really valuable to our fisheries organisations, because we don't know where they breed, when they breed, or how they breed. So simple photographs can be so useful. An example of squids that you might have seen, does anyone recognise these squids? Anyone seen one of these? They're very difficult to tell apart from the other one as well, so it might be that you've seen either one and not really realised. But again, they're super cosmopolitan. You'll find them all over Europe and the Mediterranean, and much further on as well. Now, the bobtail squids are really interesting. Again, there's probably a half a dozen species, when I only considered there to be one really, Cephalopods atlantica, which is one that you more often see. It could be that we're actually seeing others in the shallows as well. Now, Cephalopods atlantica is tiny. Many of you who have seen bobtail squids will know just how small they can be. This isn't a particularly large snake-like anemone, but you can see how it dwarfs the bobtail squid, and that's a fully grown adult. And again, we know very little about many of them. These pictures quite clearly indicate that this has been caught, probably dead, and then fixed. So all the information we have is about their external anatomy and internal anatomy. We know nothing about their behaviours at all. But nevertheless, we have loads of different bobtail species, which again turned out to be a little bit of a surprise. Okay, so to finish off this talk, only 25 more slides to go. not really, I think it's about 10 hopefully. I want to talk about really why I got you here. Now, the preceding information was really a ruse to get you in the room so I can beg you for observations and videos and so on, because it's really exciting. And I think scientists need to give back to the community more. Ultimately, we're using your taxpayer money to fund our research. You may not be aware of that. And certainly you're not aware that our research that is published, you have to pay to read. Okay, it's absolutely ridiculous, but the publishing houses in science will charge you £35 per PDF, okay, to access the science that you funded, which is a major scandal in science as we speak, and it's really, really not on. And in some ways, scientists can give back by doing this sort of outreach work and involving the community. And one of the lovely byproducts of setting up the group I set is that you guys are really interacting. You're teaching us stuff, and I really can't overstate how much you are teaching us, like with your observations. You're not even aware of what you're teaching us, but you are helping us understand a lot more. So if you weren't aware already, citizen science is simply citizens helping scientists. You guys providing us with the data that we couldn't ordinarily get. Now, I will admit, I'm a fair weather field worker. I'd much prefer to dive in the Bahamas than I would the UK. And I'm grateful for you guys donning your dry suits and getting this information for me, because I would find it too cold. So thank you so much for not forcing me into the water. That said, even if I was a bit harder and a bit more northern-like, it would still cost an absolute fortune to dive from a research point of view. The health and safety executives make it so expensive. You need so many professional divers with you, and it becomes so prohibitively expensive. Now, recreational divers, you don't have those issues. You pay for your kit, you pay for your whatevers, your boat, maybe you have some personal insurance, who knows. But it's not the same cost. For us, it's so expensive. When you bring work into diving, it makes it unbelievably expensive. And we just can't afford it. There's so little money for this sort of research that we can't do it. So I'm going to use that excuse rather than me being too soft to get in the water. For the reasons that we need your help is that you're in the water already, so you might as well help us. And if some of you are mildly egotistical and you like getting kudos for your work, then it can't hurt to share, can you? Everyone likes a bit of a few likes and a few hearts and so on and so forth, and we all like our ego stroked every now and again. And to use the jargon in a phrase, I'm trying to press gang you into providing cephalopod observations, hopefully not forcing you against your will, at least not beforehand. So, if you can share them, it would be really wonderful. Now, if you haven't heard of certain science before, have you heard of BioBlitz? It's funny, the talk last night, nobody heard of it either. I guess you are so aquatic that you're not even aware of terrestrial world, which is great, really, because I think more focus needs to be on the aquatic environment. But BioBlitz is a fairly major thing that's helped by the BBC. It's run by Bristol University, I think. But basically, once a year, they get everyone to count the organisms in their garden, okay, the species and how many are of them, okay. And my dream really is to get everyone in the UK dive community to dive at exactly the same time, in different places ideally, and to count the number of cephalopods they see. It'd be fantastic. I don't know how many. There's probably 10,000 of you in the UK that dive regularly, maybe 5,000. I don't know. And if we could do our own BioBlitz, it'd be remarkable. It'd be really cool, and it would really emphasize that the marine environment is important, that it's used by divers, and it's a part of our natural history and our natural resource. Because we do get overlooked. If you watch Springwatch, for example, it's all about the terrestrial stuff. I'm so sick of birds. I just want to see something in the marine environment. You should really call it Bird Watch, because it's just birds. And I love Chris Backham and Michaela Strachan for different reasons. But it would be nice if they just had some more marine stuff. And really, it's a chicken and egg scenario. Unless we publicise what we do and what you are up to, unless we get out there and show them that there's loads of us doing this, then there's no reason why the BBC would come to us. So I've been trying to promote this work, but it's not just about my research. It's about you guys and as a community and working together. And it sounds kind of soft, but we can be more than the sum of our parts here. We can be more than individuals, and we can share our experiences and provide great service to the animals that we know and love. So I set up this group called UK Cephalopod Reports in November. It's not been that long actually. It's been really exciting. And this started off because I was harassing people on UK Viz Reports, which I'm sure you know, asking them for photographs, and the site owner quite rightly told me to bugger off and make my own group. So I thought, okay, and lacking in imagination, rather than calling it UK Viz Reports, I just called it UK Cephalopod Reports, and here we are now. And that's been live since November 2017, and we have over 400 members now, so it's not insignificant, it's getting there, it's doing quite good. We have well over 500 observations of various cephalopods, which are really, really interesting. many new discoveries. I'll show you a couple of them in a minute or two. And it's now become a European-wide project. We have 5 more groups. We have a French, German, Spanish, Italian, and Dutch version. And we're hopefully going to roll it out to all of the Northeast Atlantic, into the Scandinavian countries, and through that the entire Mediterranean. So it's your initial work that has led to this sort of momentum that we've really got a large amount of momentum now. It's really exciting. And yeah, it's just been really, really exciting. So some of the things that we've seen, for example, Claire Johnson provided this really grainy footage. And one thing I really want to point out, right, I know you want to show off how brilliant a photographer you are, and there are some outstanding marine photographers there, and it can be very intimidating, I must admit. But from my point of view, I don't care, okay? It doesn't have to be a super brilliant photograph or video. It's not what I'm looking for, okay? I'm just looking for novel things, which you may not even realize are novel. But we've got this really grainy footage of maybe 30 cuttlefish all swimming together in a big school. Now again, I would love to publish this, but it's just one observation. Now this happened in actually September. Now you might expect this to happen in May or April when they're all returning to breed, but no, this is actually September, late September as well. Massive school of them, all swimming in the same direction, all acting as a collective. Now we've never ever seen cuttlefish school before. This is a completely unique one-off, scientific discovery, but it needs more evidence. We need to see more of it for it to be publishable and for scientists to take it seriously. We've also discovered a huge amount of evidence that females also use these zebra patternings as well. This is a female here who's scrunching her face because she's possibly preparing her eggs. But the scientific literature says that females don't do this. They don't use the zebra patterning at all. But from your reports, I've seen hundreds and hundreds of videos and photographs of females doing this behaviour that we didn't think they do. And this is really important. And as I showed you the video before, the male doing the weird thing, again, we need more evidence of this. One-off observations aren't sufficient to really say scientifically that something is occurring. And we've even made charts and graphs as well. I mean, how scientific is that? This is real science, okay? When it comes to the octopods, again, we tantalizingly, I sort of trawl Google images for L.D. serosa, the curl octopus, and this is tantalizingly close. It looks just like the veined octopus using the coconut shells, doesn't it? You can see it's using these 2 shells here. Now, it's a still. I just want to know what's it going to do with those. And now it's not, I can't get in the waters and see these because of the reasons I've explained why before, but you guys might see something like this, and if you do, it'd be a major scientific discovery to know that other species of octopuses are also using tools in this way. And as I say, there's examples of octopuses burying themselves. We had no idea that they do this when they're out of the water, and again, finding them above the tide line was completely unexpected. Now, there's some anecdotal evidence that they may have done this in the past, but we now have hundreds of observations using GIS, which is a global information software, to plot where these occurrences. And we can make nice, pretty diagrams showing where in the UK you're seeing octopuses below the tide line or above the tide line. And this data comes entirely from you guys, okay? People like you in the dive community who are giving us these observations, which are making really, really good science. And again, to labour this point a little bit, we thought these were extinct in our waters, and we've had handfuls of observations since the 1960s. Fishermen complaining that their lobsters are being stolen because these guys are notorious for it. But we're starting to see more and more in our waters based on the information that you're providing, and it's so important that you keep doing this. But some of the videos are really great as well. For example, we had hardly any information about what bobtail squid do. And this is an example of a bobtail squid being pushed along a little bit, and in a moment you'll see it drop to pseudomorph inks. So this ink is, you'll see in a second when it's triggered. But he does this to try and distract the predator and be quite clear. And you can see, if you were a predator that's colourblind, you wouldn't necessarily know which one of those is actually your food. You might go after the wrong one, and the bobtail might live to fight another day. But then extraordinarily, it sees another one and kicks off with it, which we really didn't expect. We've never seen bobtail squid fight in the wild, and it sounds such a simple, basic thing. But actually, it's really exciting to see what these guys do when they fight. And the little guy who lost went white. He was, obviously really annoyed and scared, so he went white and disappeared. And it's stuff like this, which no one has ever seen before. You're only the second group after last night to have seen this. It's really novel stuff, and thanks to Andy Jackson, as always, for providing it. And even more basic stuff, really. It was a really nice cuttlefish video of a cuttlefish hunting at night. And when cuttlefish hunt during the day, whenever they strike on something, they flash a colour. And we have no idea what that meant. We didn't know if it was like surprise that it caught something, or it was delight that it caught something. All we knew is that they did it. And we didn't know why. And we didn't even know if it was real or if it, if it was just sort of something they did accidentally and it had no meaning or something. But you'll notice that at night, and I know the camera's shining a light on them, but you'll notice at night it didn't change colour at all. Now simply from this, we can tell that the signal is a signal. It's a message to something because it only does it when there's sunlight there. So very simple stuff like this that you might take for granted actually can reveal an awful lot and can send us down new avenues of research we wouldn't have considered before. And that's one of the major benefits, is that these things prompt us to go in different directions and change our point of view. So the future plans are more talks like this. I'm going to Guildford tomorrow night and then Brighton on whatever day it is after that. And we're coming back to the southwest again, in early January or early in the new year. So if some of you didn't make it tonight, then perhaps you'll be able to see it on the second visit. And basically more begging. I really need more information from you. You guys are doing such a great job, and I'm so grateful. But we need more, unfortunately. So how can you help? Well, you can join the group. I know many of you have already, and I'm very thankful for that. You can share the group of the members of the dive community, your dive community, or other dive communities generally. Report observations. That's the bread and butter of all this as well. And I really want to emphasize that your videos don't have to be publishing or broadcast standard, okay? It really doesn't. Some of the best, exciting things have come from the worst footage, essentially. You never know what you've got. Now, if you've got files and files and files that you can't be bothered uploading, and I empathise, it's not easy uploading all these things. I'll pay for a hard drive to be posted to you with an envelope that you can post back to me, okay? Dropping and clicking and pasting files is a bit easier than posting up to Facebook, okay? And I will do that. I'll pay for that out of my own pocket, because the information is so important and so valuable. So if you have a treasure trove of footage, let me know, and I'll organise a way of getting it from your hard drive into my brain some way. Okay. One last thing I want to talk about, and there's a reason for this, and it's only really occurred to me in the last few years. I started investigating cuttlefish because I was an aquarium manager at a research aquarium. And in 2011, the law changed, and we were not allowed to do evil things to cuttlefish, or cephalopods generally, without a license anymore, or without a license. And that's good, that's progressive, and that's what we want to see, because the evidence for suffering is overwhelming. But the Home Office also demands that we have a very good idea about their captive environment, what they prefer, because they tell us that we have to give them exactly what they want, otherwise we can't keep them, which again is very good, very progressive. Unfortunately, we had no idea. Nobody knew what they preferred, especially the cuttlefish. So in my lunch times and various times when I was supposed to be doing other things, I actually did some experiments using preference testing. So I gave cuttlefish different environments and measured their behaviours in different environments and determined they like some environments more than another. And cuttlefish and octopuses, and probably squid as well, are actually very, very good at telling you what they like. They'll use the displays that I showed, and I'll show you again in a second, how they feel about a particular environment, and you can actually quantify that and then learn which environment will produce more. There's a few reasons why we might need to change our behaviour when it comes to dealing with cephalopods in the wild. They are not like fish. They're very different, and although we do think that fish can feel and suffer, etc., they have very different adaptations, which makes it very hard for them to escape a situation that they don't like. So I know you guys have a great respect for the environment, and I'm really not trying to assume that you're not. I know you all do, and every diver I speak to has a great respect for the animals within their environment. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get across is that cephalopods are different, and you might need to think of them a little bit differently. So let them choose their own level of interaction. Cuttlefish are very well known for being quite inquisitive, and octopuses are as well. But sometimes they just don't feel like it, and perhaps leave them alone if they don't want to do it, because the next time you dive, you may find one that do. And if they feel like being curious, then join in with them. If you don't, then leave them alone. The problem they have is that this is very different to fish, is that if you chase after them, they are very fragile and damaged very, very easily, and they don't recover from these injuries. So if you see an octopus and it's giving you the signal that it's not happy, and you keep going forward, it'll jet backwards and it'll be looking at you, but not seeing what's in the background. Now, if it hits a rock full of barnacles and scratches its very delicate skin, it won't recover from that. It'll get infected, it could be eaten more quickly by a predator, and it'll certainly be a negative consequence for it. So by chasing them, as is the tendency to do, we're actually potentially causing a great deal of damage. Now, fish are different. They're much more streamlined and much better at swimming away from you, and as you probably know, much harder to get close to as a result. And sadly, from a chasing point of view, cephalopods are terrible swimmers. Apart from the squid, which are designed to swim long distances, cuttlefish and octopus are awful swimmers. They run out of energy very, very quickly. And if you chase them long enough, they'll just really exhaust themselves, and they'll just have to sit there for quite a while recovering. Now, you might have chased it and got close to it, taking your photograph, not realizing you've exhausted it because you treat it like a fish, and a fish could go around in circles for days and you'd never catch it. But the poor cuttlefish might sit there, be so exhausted that it needs to recover for an hour or so, but gets eaten while it's waiting to recover. So I think we need to treat cuttlefish and octopuses a little bit differently than we would do regular fish in the marine environment because of these very specific reasons. And there's a number of signals which will tell you that they don't want to interact at that particular time. As I said, these dark eye spots are a threat or a warning to you to back off. They normally do this when you go over them, and you probably will have seen it before. So try and avoid swimming directly over a cuttlefish if you can. And if it's flattening in its body, it means it's worried about something. It's trying to make itself look bigger and doesn't want to be involved with you at that particular time. And these can lead on to further behaviours which involve jetting and, like I say, becoming exhausted or crashing into the environment and damaging themselves. Normally, this is the first warning by a cuttlefish where it's sort of giving you the two-finger salute. And, you know, it's comparable to how we might use it as well. It's saying, please go away in the nicest possible way. But octopuses, again, do something very stereotypic in that they'll go white, they'll do this ghosting colour, and they'll let you know, they'll change colour rapidly, and they'll let you know that they're not happy and that you need to back off. And I'm not saying you should never go near cephalopods, or that if you see that, then you should flee as well and crash into something and damage your skin. I'm just saying, just move away a couple of feet, give it a chance to acclimatise to your presence there, and then see what happens. And if it's still not happy, then perhaps think, well, we'll look at it another day. Because these guys are different to fish. I don't think we can treat them exactly the same way. And this is based on my research in a captive setting where we learned and understood their behaviours with respect to not being happy. So this comes from real science. This is not necessarily me being overreactive. This is based on real data. We do know that these signals will lead to potentially damaging behaviours. Penultimate slide, you'll be glad to hear. One way that scientists have to justify their existence these days is to show that our work has impact. Okay? And the only way that we can do that is by seeing what you guys think. So after this talk, if you have a moment, and the link is on the webpage, there's just 6 questions. Okay? It takes you like 30 seconds to do. Now I can accumulate all these survey questions and then show the research funders or my bosses that this work has value, that you guys do understand what we're trying to do, are interested, and are willing to cooperate, if you like, and work as a team. So if you could just answer these 6 questions at some point, and there's no rush, I'd be extremely grateful. And that is nearly the end. I'd like to thank UK Viz Reports because, again, it's me spamming them with requests that forced me to do this, and it turned out to be a brilliant thing, so thank you very much. Andy Jackson's been a real help. He's provided some amazing footage, and I'll be eternally grateful for his help. Many of you might be regulars on the site. I'm sorry if I don't recognise you by face or name, but there's lots of regular posters who provide some amazing stuff. CFAS have been a great help as well. They're going to help us hopefully get some funding for this research. And most importantly, for you guys for turning up tonight, for listening to me blather on about cephalopods for an hour and a half. And if you want to call me a poor man's Brian Cox, I'll accept that. Thank you. Anybody got any questions? Don't know if that's a good or a bad thing.
Plastic in the oceans. How's that affect
Pardon me?
you? Plastic in the ocean. How's that affect you?
That's an excellent and poignant and timeful question, actually. We've just, this very last week or so, I was in Faro. We've just started a project on microplastics in cephalopods, and we've, again, thanks to my colleague Antonio Sykes, who I think might even be watching this. Hello, Antonio, if you're watching. We've actually discovered a way to detect particles of plastics in cephalopods. Otherwise, we have no idea. We've only just developed the method. Now, it's likely that they will be in there, at least in the wild specimens, because everything they eat has them as well. Now, to be honest, it's not really a question of do they have microplastics, because we're starting to think that everything does, including us. We have microplastics inside us as well. It's becoming a question of what are the biological consequences of that, really. So I think that's the next step in marine ocean plastic issue, is not whether it's there or not, it's what it's actually doing on an internal level to animals like cephalopods and so on. Yeah?
My wife Julie and I have been studying sort of longshore drift and long ball drift that washes up on beaches, and the elegans and the orbignana bones that you find tend to wash up at specific times,
Okay.
as opposed to when the others are washing up. Ours tend to wash up at the end of breeding, well, through the year in various sizes, but we notice every once in a while certain conditions we get these washing up. We don't really know where they're coming from. Lots of them have goosebumps attached to them, which would indicate they've been in the ocean for some time.
Yeah.
And drifted from a long way out. Goosebumps only occur in inshore waters, so anything that washes up with them would indicate that that's where they're coming from. But it's kind of all or nothing with them. We'll go out to some beaches and we'll find loads and loads, particularly the elegants, the small ones, and then nothing for years.
For years?
Yeah, for years. You
Okay.
won't find any at all.
That's really interesting, because I think you're alluding, you predict that after they're breeding you find a lot at once, but obviously they're breeding every year, so the fact that they're not turning up every year is
Well,
interesting.
It's the combination of all the other things that wash up. Again, 2015 we had an exceptional year where we were getting masses and masses of long haul drifts, drift that's come right across the Atlantic.
Okay.
Animals, from the Caribbean.
Wow.
We've seen all sorts of things. I've got crabs and things at home from the Caribbean that washed up on Chesapeake that I've had for a couple of years in the fish tank, and same with cuttle bones. They tend to wash up in gluts, and then I guarantee if you went up to the beach now you wouldn't find either of those two cuttle bones.
Okay, that's really interesting.
And then actually after a big storm, and for some reason they're all there. It's only certain storms, and it's something we've been trying to get our heads around, but it's scientists and everybody are kind of reluctant to dip their toes in it, because you get these El Ninos and things where, again, like 2015, we're getting so much stuff in the Caribbean, absolute gluts of marine litter, species, and then other years we get the orbignans and the elegant nutfish, which I think are probably from somewhere else.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting, because I do see these smaller species on, for example, in Falmouth I found a lot over the couple of years I lived there, so I wonder if where you are specifically is a separate route, but like I say, I think other people as well have noticed them each year as well, but it's very interesting, your observations, and that they all turn.
Cornwall's probably more prolific for them because it's Atlantic facing.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But a lot of the longshore drift we get is from Morocco. In fact, we get octopus pots washing up that have originated in these plastic octopus pots that they fish for them, and they use them in Morocco, and they've drifted from Morocco to the Caribbean and then back across the Atlantic to the UK.
Wow.
We don't get them from Morocco.
Okay.
So it's interesting to see how it all works.
Yeah, and you've sort of highlighted the importance of your guys having observations. Like in science, the quote like anecdote doesn't equal data, and it's true. We shouldn't treat individual isolated incidences as something important. But when you accumulate these anecdotes, it gives us direction to go in, which we wouldn't have thought about before. So observations like these and the many others that you've made are extremely important. Any other question?
I was reading. Sorry. I was reading maybe 3 or 4 years ago about an experiment where they put some cuttlefish into an environment with an MRI scanner.
Really?
Do you know of this?
No, I haven't heard that.
And so they would then be using the MRI to monitor what was happening within the cuttlefish whilst they changed the patination of the background. So they then did it in the absence of light, so they put it in a dark room, and they found that with the MRI scanners, they found that the cuttlefish was still able to patinate in the absence of light as they changed the background colour.
Yeah, I'm aware of the evidence that, like you say, that in complete darkness they can pass and match their background, and also hunt fairly successfully in pitch black conditions.
How are they doing that?
I don't know. No idea.
Has it got something to do with this intelligence in the skin that you're talking about?
No idea. I mean, one of the interesting things about cephalopods, and when I was doing my undergrad degree, it was a little bit disheartening in some ways because it looked like everything had been discovered. Now, if you'd been born 150 years ago, you could trip over something, describe it, and you'd be a member of the Royal Society. These days, it's much, much harder. All the really easy stuff has been done already. All the low-hanging fruit has been picked. So it seemed like we're, in some ways, if I was being cynical, a bit negative about things, that we're just tweaking the minutiae in a large degree in the animal kingdom. But cephalopods constantly surprise us. They're constantly doing things that you completely unexpected. And even very recently, the way that they use DNA to make proteins is completely different to all the vertebrates. They actually modify a middle process of DNA to protein in a completely unusual way, unlike anything. And this is what gives us this idea, perhaps incorrectly, that they are alien. In fact, it's been used by scientists, unfortunately, that they are alien-like. And of course, the media picks up on this, and then it becomes common knowledge, if you like, that cephalopods are from Mars or something. But the truth is actually more interesting. They are from this planet. They are remarkable. They are completely different to everything else that we know, and are still continually surprising us with experiments like you pointed out. And excitingly, there's still so much to learn, which is again why you guys are important, because you are helping us learn with these observations. Okay. Yeah.
With your interest in fossils, and while you're here, are you going to be taking a little bit of time to visit the Etches collection?
No, unfortunately not. I'm going to be leaving quite early tomorrow morning, but I'm familiar with this area's remarkable fossil record. I would like to have spent more time here, but unfortunately can't.
The Etches collection, Steve Etches, who made the collection, was the guy who actually discovered ammonite eggs.
Oh, cool.
So.
Yeah, no, I'd love to, but unfortunately I'm in Guildford tomorrow giving another talk. But as I say, I'll be back here at some point, either to repeat the talk or to give an update, if you like. A question over there?
Yeah, it's not really a question, but we have a light trap that we use. It's a bit like an underwater moth trap.
Yeah.
Put out at night to catch a small aquarium to catch food, and also we look at our catch as well before we fry, and we quite often catch Cephalopods in the
Yeah, the bobtail, one of the bobtail squids.
Yeah, are they known to be attracted by the light?
It would make sense. I mean, we don't know too much about their behavioural ecology. So again, observations like that are really useful. If that is correct, then they're acting a little like the true squids, if you like, and they're attracted to light, because a lot of fishermen use light fishing to entice squid. But generally, you guys will tell me more than anything that you see them at night more often, don't you? So they're certainly active at night as opposed to the day. I don't think there's very few, if any, records that I've seen or observations of you guys providing evidence that you see bobtails during the day. There was a photograph of one next to a snake lock anemone, but that could have been taken at night with a bright light. So I would suspect, yes, they are acting in a predatory way at night, and perhaps they are attracted to light in some ways, because many animals will bioluminesce, not to the degree that it looks like a bright light in the water. In fact, to such a minimal degree that we can barely see it. But nevertheless, that is an attraction to them, and perhaps you're just providing this super stimuli of attraction that they all flock towards. Yeah.
I've noticed diving previously off Chisel when I've had video like I saw them recording on GoPro a year or two ago, but actually the more inquisitive cuttlefish will actually almost be mesmerised by the lights, and they'll sometimes try and change colour to try and, well, it appears that they're trying to change colour to match the lights somehow, but they're constantly get it right. Is that something you've come across?
No, absolutely. And there's still loads that we don't know. I mean, something I didn't mention, which I normally like to mention, is that wherever we look, animals have personalities. No matter what species we look at, even things like lowly nematodes seem to have a personality individually. They fall onto what's called the bold or shy spectrum, and cephalopods are no different. You'll find that animals are super bold. Some octopuses will be super bold and will want to interact with you, but then the next one in the same species won't be interested at all and want to run away from you or jet away or whatever they do. And the reason that we have personality is that in times of plenty, shy individuals don't need to take risks, and they'll gorge and they'll do well and they'll reproduce and pass their genes on. But in times of plenty, bold animals will still take risks and still get eaten, perhaps more often and not pass their genes on as much. But in times of famine, the shy individuals don't get anywhere, they don't take risks, and they don't get the food, and they don't pass their genes on. Whereas in time of famine, the bold individuals do take risks and are occasionally successful and pass their genes on. So natural selection favours this huge variation in individual temperament or personality within a population, and that's true for humans, it's true for cephalopods, and true for nearly everything that we've looked at so far. So although our personality is incredibly complex and has all sorts of environment and genetic interactions, much like a cephalopod would do, nevertheless, nearly all animals we look at have this degree of personality. So don't be surprised if sometimes cuttlefish are super curious and want to engage with you, and then equally on the other hand, don't be surprised if sometimes they're not interested, because some individuals just won't like you no matter what you do, whereas some individuals will like you no matter what you do. So it really is important to gauge what the animal is doing and their level of interest. Let them choose the level of interaction rather than us doing it ourselves. Okay, is there no more questions? Okay, one more.
Right, because you mentioned their intelligence and like their sort of sentience and stuff, and I remember from that Blue Planet 2 video when the male was disguised, the smaller male was disguised as a female, and then he went back to being a male and then bred her. And I think they said that females can like expel the sperm sac of the one they don't want to breed with, and they take in the one they do want.
Yeah, I mean that's actually too.
The intelligence, like they've chosen.
No, you don't actually need intelligence to do that. You'll find that in a lot of inverts. They'll actually eject sperm based on probably chemical cues. So that's not necessarily an indication of intelligence, although they are clearly super intelligent. I think the fact that they use tactical deception, that they deceive one another based on their own level of ability to compete, is super intelligent, more so than some animals. But in this case, I don't think that is necessarily, because, for example, humans will pair based on unconscious smells. It's to do with major histocompatibility. We're basically looking for individuals that are dissimilar to us in a defensive immune way. And we can actually smell each other unconsciously and know if we're compatible in that way. And that doesn't necessarily take intelligence, that's sort of a hardwired ability. And I suspect, based on the limited evidence, that what you're describing, again, probably is chemical based rather than I prefer this little guy. But it could be, it's just something we haven't investigated yet. And you never know, you might be right. Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully that means there's no more questions. So thank you again for listening. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.